Hello everyone, and welcome to a presentation on European feudalism in the early Middle Ages. Here we see the core of the feudal hierarchy system, with the king at the top, nobles second, knights third, and peasants or serfs at the bottom. We will revisit this structure as we break down feudalism. Let's start with a brief introduction to feudalism. The feudal system is the social, economic, and political condition in Western Europe during the early Middle Ages. It is the period from the 5th century to the 12th century when the kingdoms began to emerge as effective centralized units of government. Let's see some of the key characteristics of feudalism. In European feudalism, the ownership of all land was vested in the king. Beneath him was the most important noble holding land direct from the king, the hierarchy of nobles. Some of the main features of feudalism are the castle. It was the main characteristic of feudalism. Lords had lived in a castle. Manor. Feudal lords had more than one manor. This is a land which is associated with the castle. The domain. Land that remained for the lord's use after distributing the lands among his vassals is called the domain. The feudal society. The serfs had no land. They worked in the land owned by the lords and knights in the society. Knights. Knights took a fight with the enemy and protected the weak. During this period, knights learned how to prepare weapons and horses and had to spend a night inside the church in prayer. Feudal lords. The lords had many tasks to perform, employment in the work of government, army, and diplomacy. Their duty is to save their subjects from the owner of the land of a vassal. Another key characteristic of feudalism. Feudalism normally focuses on the fief and the vassal, where fief is the property or land granted in return for military service. The vassal is a person who renders service, generally military, in return for a fief. In this case, the vassal swears fidelity to the lord who will grant the fief. After understanding some of the key characteristics of feudalism, let's take another look at this picture. The king owned all of the land in the country, and he made the laws. He gave an area of land called a fief to the rich lords and nobles. In return, the lords and nobles agreed to supply the king with soldiers and horses for his army. The nobles gave some land to professional soldiers. In return, these professional soldiers, known as knights, fought for the nobles and the king. Peasants worked the land for the nobles and knights, who in turn offered them protection. After understanding the characteristics of feudalism, let's see how they changed over time. The castle. Castle design changed greatly over time, over the course of feudal times. The first castles were motte and bailey castle, made from earth and wood near the end of the 5th century. These castles could be built quickly and were better defense than no structure. They also signified the presence of the Normans. The second phase of the castle design was the shell keep castle. This was basically a motte and bailey castle surrounded by a thin layer of stone. Norman stone castles were built to keep attackers from burning the castle down. The downsides of these castles were they took years instead of weeks to build. Concrete castles were the final stage of castle building. They had reinforced outer walls and extra circular exterior walls. This prevented people from burrowing under the corners and destroying the building foundation. The manor. The manor design, unlike castle designs, did not change much during the feudal period. They were built from stone for defense, and most had the same functional rooms. It wasn't until the Tudor period in England that the manor ceased to be a fortified house, around the 15th century. The manor house became a more broad term used to describe a large house. The domain. The domain was the land retained by the lord to be worked by the serfs. Over time, serfdom became less common, and these lands were leased out. The feudal society. The start of the feudal society was necessary to protect the common folk. They paid greatly to live in the defense of lords. The lords gave land as a personal bond to their vassals. Eventually, this bond became more hereditary rather than a personal connection, and defense of the common folk became less necessary. Nobility no longer fought, which reduced their claim on power. Finally, the Black Plague was a main factor in the end of feudalism. Looking more at how feudalism changed. The knights. Knights were loyal servants of lords, and they assisted the lord in military combat when called upon. Over time, knights began to become lords themselves, as it became more common to grant land to a knight for excellence in military combat. The feudal lords. Feudal lords were originally noblemen who had a personal bond with the king. These lords were then granted land by the king in exchange for their loyalty to that king. Over time, the lords ceased to have a personal relationship with the king, and the title became more hereditary. Lords also began to accept land from multiple kings, and the title liege lord was created to show the lord which held their allegiance. Why did feudalism develop after the fall of the Roman Empire? Feudalism developed because of the chaos that affected Western Europe for many centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire. This need for some sort of political system is how feudalism ended up being created. This system gave structure to pretty much all forms of society. With the king appointed complete control, his vassals were given large plots of land as long as they remained faithful to the king. The feudal system helped Western Europe and its newfound leader establish a system of justice and a new economy. Let's look at common practices of feudalism and how did the practice of feudalism vary across Europe. The feudal system meant that the king is the only one who doesn't have a ruling lord above him. He owed loyalty and services to no one in exchange for protection and land. Nobles and sometimes churches will let kings use their soldiers or influence to protect the land in exchange for land grants. The difference in feudalism throughout Europe depended on different things, according to Haley Lang. The factors are strength of the institution, Romanization, difference of the new Germanic societies. Romans had very highly developed governments. They emphasized learning and the belief that the state was more important than the individual. Germanic people lived very differently than the Romans. They chose to live in small communities and maintain order through traditions and written rules. Because of that, they never developed larger governments or trade systems. Let's see how feudalism serves as a precursor to Western democracy. Feudalism's hierarchy structure is an analogous yet different to Western democracy. In Western democracy, the checks and balances amongst the three divisions of government function as an evolved, egalitarian form of hierarchy found in feudalism. Notions of economic development, individual freedom, and the role of religion during feudalism directly contrast Western democracy. Western democracy exhibits a complete reversal of these notions. Feudalism and Western democracy share similarities in structures, but the ways in which the two function are illustrative of two opposing viewpoints. In conclusion, feudalism ended up being the government, social, and political structure of medieval Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. It greatly affected how societies were run, the rights and responsibilities of all the people within a society. The leadership of vassals under the rule of the king helped bring order back to a chaos-filled Western Europe.